There. Good morning, everyone. You are at DPLA's webinar titled Representations of Gender and Sexuality in Metadata. We are going to give it just a minute or two to let folks roll in, and then we'll get started. That's a lot of people.
It's very exciting when you think to yourself, like, I do this work and I think it's really important and I wonder if people care about it. And then you get an answer that is a resounding yes.
Yep. Congratulations. Before we end. All right, I'm seeing those numbers, excuse me, sort of starting to steady a little bit. So we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome to Representations of Gender and Sexuality in Metadata, the first workshop in the series titled Practical Approaches to Reparative Description. And these are hosted by DPLA's Metadata Working Group. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping items for you. First, please note that this workshop is being recorded. Please put your questions for our presenters into the Q&A. This will be monitored and questions will be answered at the end of all of the presentations. Please don't forget to sign up for the 2 other workshops in this series if you have not already, and there will be a link in the chat for that. And the final housekeeping item is that I do want to remind folks that there is a DPLA board meeting on April 22nd. So if you haven't looked at that yet and got it on your calendar, please see the DPLA events page for more details. Here is a brief summary of the content of today's workshop. Capturing information about gender and sexuality in descriptive metadata often surfaces questions and unique considerations about how to effectively maximize exposure of diverse collections without mislabeling or putting members of vulnerable communities at increased risk. At this presentation, attendees will hear a variety of perspectives on strategies for how to approach the capture of this information, as well as how to implement existing resources to help enhance collection metadata. Our presenters for today are Anne Lally, Bree Watson, and Michael Stewart, and I'll go ahead and introduce them now. As the University of Washington's Special Collections Digital Collections Curator, Anne Lally is involved in the processing and arrangement of incoming digital materials, as well as curation and quality assurance of the web archiving program. Anne has been working at UW with digital projects as a project manager, a consultant, and an active participant since 2003. She has been an active participant in local and regional metadata and usability initiatives. And before coming to UW, Anne worked as the Associate Director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab at the University of Arizona in Tucson. Bree Watson is a disabled, white, queer, and non-binary settler living in Musqueam, Sully-Washouth, sorry for the mispronunciation, and Squamish. They are currently a veneer scholar at the University of British Columbia's iSchool, focusing on histories of information and the practice of equitable cataloging in libraries, archives, museums, and special collections. Watson is the archivist historian of the American Psychological Association's Consensual Non-Monogamy Committee and the Haslam Collection on Polyamory at the Kinsey Institute. They served on the editorial board of Homosaurus, an international linked data vocabulary for queer terminology. And our last speaker is Michael Stewart. He is a metadata librarian at the University of Delaware and the metadata specialist for the New Jersey Delaware Digital Collective, which is a regional hub of DPLA. They currently serve as the chair of the Program for Cooperative Cataloging's Task Group on Gender, as well as in a liaison role from this group to the PCC's Task Group on Privacy and Name Authority Records. And with that, I will hand it over to our first presenter, who's Michael.
Howdy, everybody. I'm so excited to get the chance to talk to you today, and thank you, Helen, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which I realized I intended to do a little bit ago and then didn't. So are folks seeing a slide now? Okay,
We
awesome.
are.
I'm Michael Stewart. As Helen mentioned, I'm working at the University of Delaware. So I'm actually going to get things started with a living land acknowledgement that we do, because I'm also on land that the University of Delaware I'm right in the proximity of the university. The University of Delaware occupies lands vital to the web of life for Lenape and Nanticoke, who share their ancestry, history, and future in this region. UD has financially benefited from this regional occupation, as well as from indigenous territories that were expropriated through the United States land grant system. European colonizers and later the United States forced Nanticoke and Lenape westward and northward, where they formed nations in present-day Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario. Others never left their homelands or returned from exile when they could. We express our appreciation for ongoing Indigenous stewardship of the ecologies and traditions of this region. And while the harms to Indigenous people and their homelands are beyond repair, we commit to building right relationships going forward by collaborating with tribal leadership on actionable institutional steps. Alrighty, so we're going to start talking about name authority data. For those of you in here who are not catalogers or not working primarily in a MARC environment, I apologize. I'm trying to make this as relevant as possible, as well as being practical. But a lot of the kind of history that we're going to talk about is going to be kind of couched in Program for Cooperative Cataloging, or PCC, history and implementation in bibliographic and authority contexts. The three major points, I'm going to kind of speed through the history of the conversation that's been going on for about a decade now. I'm going to talk a little bit about places where gendered information is currently being indirectly captured, or places that we're seeing it that we shouldn't be seeing it. And then as my kind of practical piece, I want to talk a little bit about some of the underpinning principles that are guiding the conversations that we're having in these task groups. I do want to make a quick disclaimer that what I'm speaking about here, I'm speaking about very candidly, and the final word on this is going to be coming out from the relevant groups, the task group on gender and the task group on privacy and name authority records. I still think that a lot of the advice that I have to give, or the considerations that I have to provide, are going to be valid. But if you want the kind of beat by beat prescriptive kind of solutions for any of the problems that I bring up, the ultimate final word is going to be in those documents when they're published. So I kind of think about the history of this conversation in four major chunks, and those chunks primarily have to do with the adoption of RDA. First up, we have kind of what was going on before we adopted the Resource Description and Access, or RDA, model in 2013, which is that gender information was not explicitly captured. Really, all that we were doing with the authority file was capturing a string and associating that string with a citation. Once we adopted RDA, however, we also implemented what were called functional requirements for authority data, or FRAD, which called for contextual information about authors to help give patrons contextual information as they encountered resources in a catalog. There are a bunch of different referent characteristics that were kind of brought in at that period. We'll talk about a couple of them in a minute. Gender is one of those, and RDA Rule 9.7 is the one that kind of referred to how to and whether to capture that information. It's worth noting that from the implementation of RDA through 2016, it was a required field. So all records that were made approximately between 2013 and 2016 should have had a 375 value at one point in time. And beyond the fact that we have kind of had a reconsideration and determined that, broadly speaking, it's not advisable to capture gender information. Even when we were capturing it, we were not doing it in maybe the best way. If we must capture it, then there are maybe certain levels and certain precautions we should be taking, and certain things that we could be doing. And as it kind of started, it was a 3-option vocabulary: male, female, not known. And it did expand a little bit, but in my opinion, it did not ever expand to a vocabulary that could have encompassed everything that it needed to serve the purpose that it was ostensibly set out to serve. So there was a lot of discussion and a lot of kind of public conversation and a lot of scholarship that emerged about recording of gender in 375, and that led to the creation of the PCC ad hoc task group on gender and name authority records. And from 2016 up through 2022, they were considering the entirety of bibliographic and authority data, and how gender was kind of being implemented, and what was kind of problematic about that capture of data. Ultimately, The final report of that group, which came out about 2 years ago, said do not record Mark 375. We are done recording that field. And a primary reason for that was because there is actually so much that needs to be kind of extrapolated. We need to make more best practices and recommendations about a lot of different fields. But if we were going to be stopping the use of 375, the members of that group felt that it was more important to give that information right away, change the practice as soon as possible, and then make remediation that much easier than if we had waited additional time for all of the subsequent recommendations to follow suit. So currently we have the task group on gender, and that's the group that I am involved in. And we have inherited all of the work that was unfinished from the previous group. Nowadays, it is advised, of course, not to record gender in 375. We are working on programmatically removing 375 data in existing records. LC and OCLC are working together on doing that. There have been a number of technical snafus, which means unfortunately it is not complete yet. And I appreciate folks from those institutions being patient as I consistently bang on their doors and ask what's going on. We are currently in a holding pattern while we actually wait for the British Library to fix some technical concerns so that they can also update their authority file synchronously as updates get pushed from OCLC to LC. Rest assured that when that is complete, I will be running around and singing and dancing, and you will hear it from wherever you are. We've also been tracking kind of larger trends, right? Last summer, a really exciting bit of news is that the International Standard Name Identifier dropped the use of gender. They had made it a required field for a long time as well due to some technical parameters, and they were finally able to deprecate that field. But the main thing that we're doing is we're looking through all of this documentation and we're thinking about the different ways that we capture data about gender. So where is that happening? Turns out it's in a whole lot of places, and we're capturing it in a whole lot of ways. So I have a couple of examples here of MARC authority data that we've been talking about, and some of the kind of primary examples and problem children that we've been dealing with in terms of the kind of use cases for these fields that we're considering. Sometimes you have MARC free text fields, right? MARC authority 667, 670, and 678, which are all note fields. And the MARC authority 100 field, subfield C. 100 is where the form of name is kept, and so the subfield C is considered part of that preferred form of name. We've had several odd, I will say, odd instances captured. One that we've talked about a lot is boy soprano, which is perhaps applicable to when somebody is performing and it captures a dimension of the performance that they're providing, which is why they are being captured in the authority file to begin with. But in addition to not following suit with kind of the general feeling that capturing gender unnecessarily is not the most ethical thing to do, it also presents an issue because this is a gender that will change, right? This is a title that will change. The idea that somebody is a boy soprano 20 years after being a boy soprano is ridiculous. Something is going to change. Either they will become an adult, they will stop being a soprano. If a person is trans, then it is even more kind of disruptive and strange to have boy soprano associated with the name. And ultimately, it'll cause more confusion later when further disambiguation is necessary. We also see people shoehorning in things like transgender author to kind of identify folks as belonging to a particular identity group. And while mostly we assume good intent with those kind of practices, we also know that A, because the field is free text, it's largely uncontrolled and inconsistent. And B, as with all things, and we'll talk about this more in just a moment, we are making assumptions about the comfort level of an author and identifying a certain way. And in a case in particular, with transgender author, we're actually not capturing gender information about the gender they identify as. We're simply identifying them as part of an underrepresented group, which again, I think is usually well-intentioned, but can often have kind of harmful consequences. Other things that we've considered come from specific vocabularies. We talk about associated groups. Some really easy ones to point out are Boy and Girl Scouts, fraternities and sororities. Also non-public organizations, which, sometimes may have memberships that are based on certain facets of identity that are not public. And so there comes up the issue of, well, if we associate this person with this organization, even if we don't say elsewhere in their record, we are potentially outing them, right? We are associating them with an organization whose membership falls under a certain identity. And if we capture a lot of information about particular organizations, we also risk then outing anybody who gets affiliated with that after that kind of point that we capture that information. I would say a major part of what we've been discussing too has been occupation terms. We use the Library of Congress demographic and group terms here. And we have noticed a number of different kind of scenarios because LCDGT is constantly being updated, but in a very piecemeal fashion. So we see some places where we still have male form of a profession name and not a female form. So for instance, we have abbot, but we don't have abbess. We have monk and nun, but we don't have the counterparts. We have instances like actor and actress, where the context actually will change whether or not that's appropriate. Sometimes you want one gender neutral term, actor. Sometimes, for instance, in repositories like IMDb, you're looking at separation of actor and actress based on award show categories. Sometimes we are seeing terms change with time. So what used to be stewards and stewardesses has become flight attendants. And then we also have some titles like kings, queens, where we actually don't mind that those are being captured because of the relatively high profile and public nature of the context of those titles, right? There's not a king or a queen that you're, there's a certain admission of kind of public life with the use of those terms. But there are a couple of other fields that I've listed here as well as some bibliographic ones. We see people capturing information in our bibliographic 386, which is creator contributor characteristics. We think about that primarily in terms of anthologies, right? If an anthology is centered around a particular identity, then that's an appropriate use of that field, but plenty of people have used it to say, if anybody from a particular identity category belongs to this, we're going to capture it here. We also think in the group about non-mark metadata, this is an area that we're kind of beginning to build momentum on. But I will mention that, no authority file lives in complete isolation. And something that we've talked about, especially with Wikidata, which I think is the largest kind of repository that still explicitly collects gender data, is how information from LC and AF ends up in Wikidata, and then how that Wikidata information is then used to justify re-entering gendered information in the LC name authority file. So this is all kind of becoming apparent as part of a larger conversation that we're having in the profession on privacy, right? Gender information is highly personal, and although we don't think of it that way necessarily because we think we understand the gender of people that we see in the street, it is also potentially highly private information. And so the questions that have been kind of some of the questions and points that have been guiding a lot of our conversations have been, how do we maximize access while we minimize risk? We never want to out somebody who is not explicitly out, who is not speaking about their identity openly in public. How do we keep them safe? And how do we make sure that their needs are met whenever it's possible, right? We always want to defer to the comfort level of the creator or the contributor. We don't want to assume, well, if you are out here presenting a certain way in the street, that gives us, the opportunity. If you look a certain way on your photo in a book jacket or something like that, that gives us the right to gender you a certain way. We don't want to make those kinds of assumptions. I think that a point that's come up a lot is the relative convenience to be gendering people, the way that can be a very simple and low-hanging way to disambiguate people. But I would say that should not take priority, both because we cannot make those kinds of assumptions safely, and also because we know that because gender is a changeable feature, that what we know as the public about a person's gender identity is perhaps not aligned with their own understanding of their gender and what they're comfortable being public about in regards to their gender. Recording this information in the short term may be convenient, but in the long term could actually create more disambiguation problems in the future. So my little practical piece to wrap things up, what do we do about recording gender? As I've said, as a general principle, don't. It's personal, it's highly private information. Unless you have consent, it's really better to avoid it when you can avoid it. If you are going to capture it, be careful. Think about things like, who is going to see this data? Are you populating, a local authority file that is completely private and will only affect kind of search behavior in your local catalog? Are you thinking about a platform like Wikidata, where that information is going to be openly available. And if you're thinking about a platform where you're, putting this information out there, are you putting the referent at risk? Right? When we think about kings or queens or people who carry titles and have a life that is highly public, it's less of a concern. But privacy is always contextual. And when we think about people who maybe have not published explicitly about their transness or about their gender identity, assuming that we have the right to speak about that, and assuming that we have the right to capture that information and record it in the authority file is not always something that is going to result in the best end game for either privacy or for safety. How is the data updated, right? If you're talking about a small group of people that you're maintaining identity information for, biographical information for, that's one thing. But if you're talking about a huge number of individuals, or if you're talking about an individual for whom you're likely to create a record and then never come back to that record, you need to consider that that information may change. And if you capture it and then there's no follow-up, that you are potentially doing a disservice to that person. And I think considering, what purpose does it serve? I've been talking about the name authority file. Is it disambiguating? And if it is disambiguating, then perhaps it's appropriate. If it's not disambiguating, don't capture it. That's not really necessary contextual information. And are you making interpretations, right? I've kind of already alluded to this, but if you're thinking about what is this person's gender? Are you also making assumptions about race? Are you making assumptions about religion? Are you making assumptions based on the area that a person is associated with? You probably wouldn't make some of those leaps as readily as I think people make these leaps in regards to gender. So I encourage that kind of that step of, am I making an interpretation, or am I taking something directly from, a trusted source of information, social media, or somebody's author biography that says, I am X, and then recording this person is X, versus taking the step to say, well, I think they're this, so I'm going to capture it like this. So that is my extremely fast, lightning quick rundown of the situation as it stands right now. I am going to pass things over to Bree to be our next presenter, and I look forward to having a conversation at the end.
Thank you for that fantastic run through, Michael. I actually didn't even know some of that history, so I really appreciate that. I will begin as we do in Canada. Just get that. By saying I am speaking to you from Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. All of that traditional, ancestral, and ceded land occupied and taken, often violently, by the so-called settler nation of Canada on Turtle Island. I am a descendant of Scots, Irish, and English settlers, and I am uninvited guest on this land, and as such, I am a beneficiary of colonialism and genocide. Canada and the United States continue this genocide today through pollution, criminal neglect, cultural extermination, and murder. I urge all of us to learn about and do what we can to support the people that we live with and the nations that we live upon, and to take action. This is the map of Musqueam, which is Vancouver. UBC is located right down here. I've already had a fantastic introduction, so I'm not really going to read any of this, but I do want to put one thing up front and center. I want to emphasize the word collective in the transmitted data collective and the queer metadata collective. The word collective is from the Middle French collectif, from Latin collectivus, meaning I collect, I gather together, I bring together. All of these things, all of these voices, all of the work done here is work that's done collectively, and in each work, the author has been named of the collective as a whole for a reason. This work's not owned by me, it's also not owned by any member of the collective, it's owned by together, much like cataloging is. So some of you, those familiar faces and names that I'm recognizing, will probably be familiar with some of this. Is based on some of the first half of it is based on some work by earlier members of the transmitted collective, sorry. And I'm not going to focus too much on the details of the recommendations because the sources are really easily available. I have a link to them in the next slide. If you're looking for more focused presentation, Jackson Huang and I did one for the Boston Library Consortium, available on the Boston Library Consortium website. There's a few different trainings on the ALA, ACRL, the OCLC websites, or you can hire a member of the collective to give you or your institution's training or review. Historically speaking, though, historically, the transmitted data collective and the queer metadata data collective, part of the critical cataloging movement, which is a movement I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's a relatively recent term, but it's part of nearly century-long tradition going back to work of pioneering Black librarian Dorothy Porter and white librarian Francis Yocum in 1930s and 40s. One of these movements have been called critical, alternative, radical, reformative. They are aimed at addressing harms and misrepresentations caused by knowledge organization systems to marginalized and minoritized individuals, communities, and their resources. Queer, trans, and gender diverse people do face special harms and risks and dangers due to metadata, especially when we think about library systems, as Michael was just talking about, where the metadata tends to linger for decades and sometimes even centuries. Many institutions have tried to collect queer material and they boast about it every June, but very often the resources have incorrect or inadequate information, or the systems themselves misrepresent gender diverse people and subjects. So, starting with the Queer Trans Metadata Collective, the initial idea for the collective originated from discussions following a panel at the University of Victoria's Moving Trans History Forward. This was a group of about 6 or 7 people, and for this, we started a group of discussions. We decided to put together a website and launch it to make a call specifically for queer and trans and gender diverse folks who worked in library and information science. This turned into library information science and museums and galleries and archives and people who work in the information profession, people who work in sociology and psychology, because it's a big concern across many systems. We received about 100 responses from the Trans Metadata Collective poll for interested people, and we developed a convening committee specifically put together from Black, Indigenous, and people of color who volunteered that information during the sign-up process. That still involved nearly 50 people in a Zoom call, which was a lot. But these initial meetings evolved into 4 different groups to allow individuals across the whole spectrum of signups to contribute based on their own expertise. The 4 groups were descriptive practices, which focuses on archival and some museum description, subject headings and authorities, which focus largely on subject cataloging, LCSH specifically, and some other stuff, name authorities and access, which is like NACO and library authorities, and ethical recommendations, which is sort of the broad umbrella group that was looking at the structure of the document, broader ethical recommendations and ideas. Each group took their own path toward developing recommendations. Some developed bibliographies first, others developed lists of subject headings, and so on. Then the working groups themselves assembled their thoughts into individual documents. People jumped on and off working groups as they were able to, contribute as they were able to. This was taking place over 2021 to 2022, 2022 to 2023, sorry. And so people were busy, sick, working, all of that. So we remained like very impressively productive considering the pandemic that was going on at the same time. As the groups finally started to come together, editors from each one of the working groups came together to combine the recommendations into the finished documents. I'm not going to go deep into this like I've already said here, but I'm going to discuss the main recommendations. Before I do that, I want to touch on why do we use the term trans and gender diverse? We decided early on that we used to use this term because we didn't want the guidelines to be like a trans 101, because this meant to be a practical resource for metadata professionals, and but gender itself in the Western world is complicated, as we're probably all familiar with. It's sometimes complicated, sometimes fraught. So we use trans and gender diverse because gender is not just about presentation. It includes your social role, your cosmological place in the universe, and the meaning and conceptualizations that are culturally specific to your culture, region, or group, or society. Obviously, there is communication and understanding and overlap between the different communities, but gender systems may require translation. They're not directly equivalent one-to-one. In the Western world, which is, United States, United Kingdom, Europe, and Canada, there's a culturally dominant understanding of gender as binary, both as man versus woman, and static. And your gender is based on sex assigned at birth, and you carry it with it through your life. Other peoples, historically and at present, have their own cosmological conceptualizations of what binary gender is, and binary and static don't really apply to any of those. So we use the term trans and gender diverse because gender is culturally specific. It's not a universal framework, and it's important in this context, in the context of libraries, in the context of museums, in the context of archives, because settler colonialism and colonialism abroad have influenced collecting policies at US and Canadian librarians and other ones to bring together resources from Indigenous people who might not use the term man, woman, so on and so forth. So in these guidelines, we want professionals to consider how these guidelines apply beyond a narrow conventional understanding of trans metadata. So in summary, the final bullet point there, while trans does not equal gender diverse, there are many overlapping issues and recommendations, and consequently recommendations. The 5 main recommendations that we have, I'll go through them one by one, where you be transparent about the process of metadata creation, and then use contextually and culturally appropriate labels. 2, 3, correct naming and identification. 4, ongoing assessment and remediation. 5, explicit mention of transphobia. So just to jump into those a little bit more. The first one is to make the process of metadata creation transparent by making descriptive standards, rationale, and context publicly available, soliciting active advice from communities. Sometimes this looks like a link on your library homepage saying like, hey, if you see something weird in the catalog or you'd like to contact us about a term, here's the email to reach out to, or here's the form to fill out. It can take many different forms. I've seen many ones, and we talk more in the Q&A about that as well. Also using culturally and contextually appropriate labels for communities and subjects. This may include claimed or self-ascribed slurs, otherwise sensitive language. If somebody's using it to describe themselves, that should take priority over the rest of the other types of description. And if it's a foreign language or a non-English language, use the original language and the script alongside added translations of whatever the word is and whatever your catalog uses. Next one is to obviously correctly name and identify individuals and community, again, relying primarily on self-identification and self-description or in direct consultation with those communities. Don't record information about gender identity or previous names when resources have nothing to do with gender identity. It's not useful information and it shouldn't belong in the catalog. And 4, this one's the one that touches on AI, identify content for metadata through assessment and prioritize for remediation. Do not use automation, do not use batch replacement for that. Use it as an assessment tool alongside qualitative analysis about the impact of existing description or cataloging. And finally, being explicit about transphobia and collection item and metadata. This might look like identifying perpetrators and victims with the use of active voice and description, or with subject heading in cataloging to embed responsibility, correctly name what's happening in the work or in the item. Work to identifying correct sensitive language, coded language, offensive or inaccurate terminology, including by other metadata creators. The broader recommendation goes through these in much deeper depth. But basically, we ended up with 50 members. We had about 100 reviewers, and this slide's actually a little bit out of date. We had about 14,000 downloads the last time I checked across various different sources. To give you just like a little preview of the size differences, the Queer Metadata Collective, which I'll talk about next, has about 100 participating members. I believe the last I counted was 86, and about 600 reviewers or recipients of the newsletters who will form the first core of the peer review process, which will be happening in a few months. So the Trans Metadata Collective transitioned into the Queer Metadata Collective. Several members, myself, Devin Murphy, and Adrian Williams, shout out to both of them, took big leadership roles in both the Trans and the Queer Metadata Collective, but many members worked between the two organizations because they were interested in broadening the impact of the recommendations and the audiences adjust. In the Queer Metadata Collective, we have chosen to use the framework of More Gay, which stands for Marginalized Orientations, Relationship, Genders, Asexualities, and Intersection, pronunciation being more gay. Why not just LGBTQ+? There's a few different reasons for that. LGBTQ, just by having the T and Q at the end and the plus, makes it broader than sexuality starting off anyways. So LGBTQ+ is, even though homosaurus uses it, it's not like a perfect 1-to-1 ratio. So we try to use the more gay framework. Why not just queer, as it's literally in the name of the heading? I don't know if anybody else has tried to define queer. It's really hard, and that's purposely hard. And probably queer is probably broader than just sexuality, probably broader than just the more gay framework itself, and if perhaps maybe should remain indefinable, generally speaking. So we chose more gay, and we chose more gay as both to correct a political choice made by earlier LGBTQ activists advocating for marriage rights. There was a political decision to exclude folks who had marginalized relationship orientations out of the gay rights movement. And also to specifically call out the exclusion, ignorance, or outright discrimination against A's, which is asexuality, aromanticism, so on and so forth. And I don't have it on the slide here, but also to like label specifically intersex people and to call that into being a very important thing of what we're trying to address. So similar structure where we made a big call. We had a convening committee made up of Black, Indigenous, and people of color to set like sort of a general framework for how we were going to start the process. The returning working groups that we had here, I have like a little bit of what they've done so far, and obviously this is a little sneak preview of what will be coming as we work to combine all the documents. The description working group has done ratings bibliography. They've assembled and reviewed descriptive processes from queer galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and special collections from around the world. I don't know, but there might be a large collection of like queer collections and finding aids, so on and so forth. I think somebody from here is in the chat and might be able to say something like that. The subject headings working group, they overlapped with members and initiative between the sexual, gender and sexuality Seco-Fundal. So shout out to gender and sexuality Seco-Fundal people. And they focused a lot on the use of Library of Congress and problematic uses of Library of Congress subject headings, as well as alternative and other harmful languages, alternative subject headings and vocabularies and other harmful languages within metadata and description. The ethical frameworks group, which was spearheaded mostly by me, started with like a reading group and people talking throughout various meetings. And then as part of my PhD process, I have been aiming for interviews with queer catalogers at institutions around the world really now. I aimed for 20 interviews and I got 70, and I'm almost through all 70 of that. And I will do one more round of recruitment for folks who are Black, Indigenous, and metadata worker of colors. This is by default of being this large number of catalogers and classifiers and archivists and metadata workers is one of the largest studies ever actually entertaining qualitative interviews of catalogers throughout the cultural heritage sector. And the two new working groups that made part of this effort were the classification working group and the name authorities working group. Classification working group has, and I also wanted to say here, shout out to Alex Curios, the editor of DDC, who gave the classification working group access to WebDewey to do some work at WebDewey. Also gave my students access to WebDewey, which is deeply appreciated. But the classification working group has also focused on LCC and a few other classifications to think about where and where not to class, collocation versus differentiation of queer materials, alternative classing systems, reclassifying, and then institutional and social barriers to this process. And the name authorities working group has worked on updating or changing name authority records, physical items, and Wikidata pages. And they've also included a list of recommended resources with templates that can be amended to fit most institutional needs, which is very exciting. So we are here in the process of putting together the queer metadata collective. Finally, the work of the groups is starting to wrap up and starting to come together. And we are hoping to bring together all these documents into the same sort of process, one document, sending out for review for those 600 emails I mentioned earlier, 600 participants or peer reviewers mentioned earlier. You can still sign up too if you want to be a part of the process. And then hopefully in June, late June, I'm assuming right now, a Pride Month in the United States, we will be able to release the final document. Thank you so much for your time.
All right. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody. I am Ann Lally from the University of Washington Libraries, and I will be talking about implementing homosaurus for digital collections. First, our land acknowledgement. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish people of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. All right, so the project team for this for this little project was Claire Indermauer, who was PhD and is a PhD candidate at the UW School. Claire originally contacted Ann Jenner and myself about this time last year about engaging in a redescription project of our Pacific Northwest materials that are housed in our digital collections. And Anne and I jumped at the chance to work with Claire because Claire is a member of the community, and it was important to us that a member of the community be the one who was able to go in and assess the value and the rightness of the metadata that was in our digital collections. So a bit of context, this project stepped into already working critical cataloging effort within the libraries. The libraries also have been working with homosaurus, so it was not unknown to us. Excuse me. And we had the opportunity to participate in an Orbis Cascade Alliance homosaurus training that happened over 3 weeks, again last summer, and we're able to obviously find value in moving forward with that metadata. All right, so the UW Library's digital collections environment, we first went live in 1997, and this will become an interest point just a little bit later in the presentation. Our digital collections are accessible via Content DM. We have Dublin Core metadata structure, which can be mapped to user-friendly field labels, and we also thankfully have a metadata implementation group who weighs in on how our metadata is presented and organized and structured for display purposes in our collections. All right, so the goal of this, of the project, was to go in and take a look at all of our metadata in our digital collections, focusing on the Pacific Northwest. We have over 400,000 records in Content DM, and that was obviously not within the scope of a summer project. So we focus specifically on Pacific Northwest terms. We chose homosaurus because we were already using it. We liked the fact that it was working with materials and principles of self-identification and positionality, and it seemed to fit both Claire's goals as a PhD student and our goals as a library. Right, so the project proceeded, and I want to say before I go any further that what I am talking about right now is based on the work that Claire did. I had a slide in here talking and thanking Claire for the work that they did. It disappeared. So I just want to acknowledge that this is really Claire's work, that she put hundreds of hours into this, and we just really, really appreciate the work that she did. And I will talk about that a little bit more in a bit. All right, so this is, I wanted to show this. So this slide shows you that we have these subject fields that are under the Dublin Core map, and we can change our local view of the fields to reflect that where they are coming from. So LCTGM, Library of Congress subject headings, and in this case, homosaurus. So we were able to add that rather quickly. All right, all right. So this is a photo that we have of from 1950 of two newlyweds and their wedding party. I'm just going to read this. So historical representations of gender nonconformity and transness have historically been complicated for memory workers who have limited in-community knowledge of these approaches to embodiment and may have limited resources to work with making sense of them. As Claire looked at this photograph and its metadata, they noticed a few things in need of correcting. First and foremost, only 2 of the 4 people in this photograph could be understood as female impersonators. Thus, Nick Arthur and Bill Scott are not represented by the subject terms applied here. Impersonators, this is a rough choice of terms to use for any of the people depicted here. Claire's kindest guess would be that this term was applied in an attempt to describe Nick Arthur. Also, only the LGBTQ plus coded term in the pre-edited record is drag. This is a good start, but will of course result in this item not being retrieved by in searches which do not explicitly include this term. All right, so here is the updated record. Female impersonator and male impersonator are great examples of term shift. Once these were completely fine and non-controversial, but have since fallen out of use in favor of other terms. The homosaurus principle of self-identification, as well as a general sense of respect for the autonomy of individuals depicted in the archival record, means that these terms do still apply, as they were the terms used self-referentially by the people depicted here. However, this could present a problem. Patrons who are not aware of this term shift may attempt searches using contemporary terms rather than these positionality situated terms. To accommodate for this term shift, contemporary and historical terms are both added to the subjects field, so as to ensure that this photo will be retrieved for searches using any of these terms. Since Jackie Starr, Skippy LaRue, and Nick Arthur did not, to Claire's knowledge, self-identify explicitly and or consistently as drag queen or king respectively, they use the broad term drag and the specific term drag performers. Here you can also see that Claire explained this in the contextual notes. All right, here we have Hotchka Hinton at a birthday party in Colorado. This Hotcho was a legendary burlesque performer and comedian. She often performed at the Garden of Allah, a Seattle venue which hosted performances by female impersonators, male impersonators, burlesque performers, musicians, dancers, and many other creatives in the early mid to 20th century. On the left is the corrected record. I'm sorry, is the item before the corrections were made. The first thing that stood out was the underlined sentence, which reads, Hinton charmed and fooled both her audiences and her interviewers into seeing her as a woman. Continuing on, the contextual note explains that Hinton lived as a woman full-time, and this was corroborated by other informational resources about her life. Trans women and trans feminine people are not fooling people by embodying their identity. Thus, out of respect for Hinton's embodied identity, Claire removed this sentence from the contextual notes about her and left in the sentence which follows it, as they thought this was satisfactory in conveying important information. Returning again to the principle of self-identification, the terms drag performer and female impersonator are not quite accurately applied to Hinton, although she did perform alongside many female impersonators and drag performers. Thus, Claire chose to use the term trans as a subject here. The homosaurus defines trans as an umbrella term used to describe individuals whose transgender regardless of their identification, sometimes used as a way to historicize non-binary identities. Transfemininity, defined by the homosaurus as feminine-aligned identities or practices, of trans people, is also applied here as a subject term. In this example, we also want to draw your attention to the contextual note, which was added to each of the records to which revisions were made. This note is used to contextualize the work that Claire did and to present and future patrons. This kind of explicit clarity can help patrons mitigate the inevitable future term shifts. Let's see. All right. Not sure. Okay. So the scope of this project was 1,099 records revised from multiple Pacific Northwest collections. Claire did their work in spreadsheets, consulted with myself and Ann Jenner, and revised as needed before the records were updated in Content DM, so we only had to do that updating once. The material types included photographs, newsletters, flyers, pamphlets, and audio. The oldest material involved in the project was from 1901, although most of them were from the 1940s through 2020. The project also included both digitized and born digital photo materials. The most recent were photographs from the Pride parades that take place in Seattle. All right, thank you.
Thank you to our three presenters. Very informative presentations, and we really appreciate the work you've done in this area and your presentation.